Did you know that your mind can play tricks on you every day? Whether you realize it or not, cognitive biases shape how you think, act, and even make decisions. In today's video, we'll explore 15 fascinating facts about cognitive biases that reveal just how complex and often misleading our minds can be. Have you ever wondered why we think the way we do, or why we make certain decisions? Well, the answer lies in something we all experience, but rarely notice: cognitive biases. These mental shortcuts can influence our thoughts, actions, and even our judgments, often without us even realizing it. In today's video, we'll be uncovering 15 fascinating facts about cognitive biases, helping you understand the quirks of your mind. So, let's get started and discover how your brain can sometimes trick you. We all like to feel right, don't we? It's a natural part of being human. But did you know your brain often works to make you feel right, even when it's wrong? This phenomenon is known as confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is when your brain actively seeks out information that supports your existing beliefs and ignores anything that contradicts them. Have you ever only listened to news from a particular source because it aligns with your views? That's confirmation bias at work. Dr. Emily Morgan, a psychologist, explains, confirmation bias isn't just about avoiding disagreement. It's actually a defense mechanism. It's easier and less stressful to stick with what we already know, rather than challenge our beliefs. While this makes us feel more confident, it can also limit our ability to grow and understand different perspectives. It's not just a minor thing either. This bias can influence everything from political opinions to personal decisions. When you encounter new information that goes against what you believe, your brain tries to push it away. It's much more comfortable to stay in the familiar territory of ideas that confirm what you already think. In today's world, confirmation bias is everywhere, especially on social media, whether it's politics, social issues, or even trending topics. Confirmation bias traps people in echo chambers, where they only hear opinions that reinforce their own. This can create polarization and prevent meaningful conversations from happening. But here's the good news. Becoming aware of confirmation bias is the first step in overcoming it. By recognizing when you're only listening to one side of the story, you can start challenging your beliefs and expanding your worldview. It's crucial to be open to new ideas, even if they challenge your current perspective. So, the next time you find yourself gravitating toward information that confirms what you already believe, take a moment to ask yourself, am I really seeking the truth, or am I just reinforcing my own biases? Being mindful of confirmation bias can help you make more informed decisions and foster a deeper understanding of the world around you. Have you ever found yourself thinking something was a great deal, only to realize later it wasn't as good as you thought? Well, your brain might be playing tricks on you, and the culprit is anchoring bias. Anchoring bias happens when your brain latches onto the first piece of information it encounters and uses it as a reference point for making decisions. This anchor becomes a mental baseline, affecting how you perceive everything that comes after it. For example, imagine you're shopping for a new jacket. The first one you see is priced at $200. Then you come across another jacket for $100. You might think, wow, what a bargain! Even though $100 might still be expensive for a jacket. That's anchoring bias at work. Your brain has anchored to that initial $200 price, making the $100 jacket seem like a steal, even if it's not a great deal at all. Dr. Mark Johnson, a psychologist, explains, anchoring bias is powerful because it shapes our perception without us even realizing it. The first number you see, or the first piece of information you hear, can unconsciously set the stage for all your subsequent decisions. It's like the first impression you get. Once it's set, it's hard to shake. This bias doesn't just apply to shopping. It affects how we assess everything from salaries to the estimated value of a home, even in negotiations. The first offer you hear, whether it's high or low, influences how you view all subsequent offers. The key to overcoming anchoring bias is awareness. Next time you're making a decision, take a step back and consider whether the initial piece of information is truly the best reference point, or if it's just influencing you without you realizing it. Have you ever found yourself thinking, I knew that was going to happen, right after an event unfolds? It might feel like you predicted it all along, but in reality, that's your mind playing tricks on you. This is hindsight bias. Hindsight bias is the tendency to believe that an event was more predictable after it has already happened. When you look back at a situation, you often feel like you knew the outcome all along, even though at the time you couldn't have predicted it. For example, after a big sports game, it's easy to say, I knew the underdog was going to win. But in the moment, you probably didn't expect it. Hindsight bias makes us believe that the past was more certain than it actually was, leading us to overestimate our ability to foresee future events. Dr. Sarah Thompson, a cognitive psychologist, explains, hindsight bias can make us feel overly confident about our ability to predict outcomes, even though the future is always uncertain. It can also lead to faulty decision-making because we tend to ignore the factors that made the outcome unpredictable at the time. This bias affects how we view our past decisions. After a failed project or a wrong call, it's tempting to think, I should have seen that coming, even though the situation was far more complex than we realize. This can prevent us from learning from mistakes, as we might believe we knew better all along. To combat hindsight bias, it's important to recognize when you're revisiting a situation with the benefit of hindsight. Reflect on how uncertain things felt at the time and acknowledge that the outcome could have easily been different. Have you ever felt more afraid of something simply because you've heard about it repeatedly? Maybe after hearing about a plane crash, you suddenly feel nervous about flying, even though statistically, flying is much safer than driving. This is an example of the availability heuristic. The availability heuristic is a mental shortcut that makes us overestimate the likelihood of events based on how easily they come to mind. In other words, when we're bombarded with information or stories about something, our brain assumes that those events are more common or likely to happen than they actually are. For instance, if you often hear news about natural disasters, you might start thinking they're more frequent than they really are. Your mind grabs hold of those vivid images or stories, making you feel like they're more likely to occur in your own life, even if the actual risk is low. Dr. Lisa Grant, a behavioral psychologist, explains, the availability heuristic relies on emotional and memorable events. Our brains tend to give more weight to recent, dramatic, or emotionally charged experiences, which can distort our judgment and make us perceive risks or probabilities inaccurately. This bias can influence a lot of decisions, from fears about travel to our perceptions of crime rates or even health risks. For example, after watching a news story about a rare disease, you might worry about contracting it, even though the actual chance is very low. The key to overcoming the availability heuristic is to question whether your perception of risk is truly based on facts or just on the stories you've heard. By looking at data and considering all perspectives, you can make more informed decisions and avoid letting emotional experiences overly influence your judgments. Have you ever noticed how the less you know about something, the more confident you feel? It's a common experience, and it's actually rooted in a cognitive bias called the Dunning-Kruger Effect. The Dunning-Kruger Effect occurs when people with limited knowledge or ability in a particular area overestimate their competence. In simple terms, the less you know, the more you tend to believe that you know. This bias happens because, without enough knowledge or experience, you don't have the self-awareness to realize how much you don't know. For example, imagine you've just learned the basics of a new language, and suddenly you feel like you're fluent, ready to have full conversations. But in reality, there's so much more to learn. People affected by the Dunning-Kruger effect often feel overly confident in their abilities because they don't yet realize the complexities of the subject. Dr. Rachel Adams, a cognitive scientist, explains, the Dunning-Kruger effect happens because, at the beginning of learning something new, people don't have enough experience to understand their own limitations. This false sense of competence can lead to poor decisions since they're unaware of what they don't know. This bias can show up in many areas of life, whether it's someone attempting to fix their car without proper knowledge or taking on a project at work that they're not fully prepared for. The more experience someone gains, the more they often realize just how much they still have to learn. It's only after reaching a certain level of expertise that people begin to accurately assess their own abilities. To combat the Dunning-Kruger effect, it's important to remain humble and recognize that learning is a continuous process. The more we understand about a topic, the more we come to appreciate its complexity and our own limitations. Ever notice how, when things go right, you're quick to credit your own skills and abilities, but when things go wrong, it's always someone else's fault? That's a classic example of self-serving bias. Self-serving bias is the tendency to attribute positive outcomes to our own actions and abilities, while blaming external factors or others for negative outcomes. It's like when you ace a test and you think, "I'm just really good at this." But if you fail, you might say, "The questions were unfair," or "The teacher didn't explain it well enough." Dr. Emma Wilson, a social psychologist, explains, self-serving bias helps protect our self-esteem. When we succeed, we want to feel like we're in control and that it's our own hard work that paid off. But when things go wrong, blaming others or circumstances helps us avoid feeling inadequate or failing to live up to expectations. This bias can show up in many aspects of life, whether it's at work, in relationships, or even in sports. For example, a soccer player might praise their own skill after scoring a goal, but blame the referee when the game is lost. This bias is a way for us to preserve a positive self-image, even when things aren't entirely in our control. While self-serving bias can give us a confidence boost, it can also prevent us from taking responsibility for our actions and learning from our mistakes. Recognizing this bias is important for personal growth. It encourages us to look at situations objectively and understand how our own actions may have contributed to both successes and failures. So, next time you find yourself taking all the credit for something good or blaming others for something bad, pause and think, am I seeing this situation clearly or am I just protecting my ego? Ever found yourself jumping on a trend just because everyone else is doing it? Whether it's a viral challenge, a new fashion style, or a popular opinion, sometimes we follow the crowd without questioning why. That's the bandwagon effect at play. The bandwagon effect is a cognitive bias where you're more likely to adopt a belief, attitude, or behavior simply because you see others doing it, whether or not it actually makes sense. It's like when a new trend takes off and suddenly everyone seems to be talking about it, so you feel compelled to join in too. Dr. Michael Roberts, a behavioral scientist, explains, the bandwagon effect taps into our desire to fit in and be part of the group. Humans are social creatures, and we often feel more comfortable following the collective consensus, even if we don't fully understand the reasoning behind it. This bias is common in many areas of life. Think about when a new product becomes a must-have, or when everyone starts discussing a certain topic on social media. Even if you don't know much about it, you might feel the urge to follow the trend, because it feels like the right thing to do. It's not just about trends, though. The bandwagon effect can shape our political views, social opinions, and even career choices. While jumping on the bandwagon can sometimes feel safe, it's important to be aware of when you're simply going along with the crowd instead of forming your own opinions. Taking a moment to question the reasons behind popular beliefs or behaviors can help you make more informed and independent choices. So, the next time you find yourself joining in just because everyone else is, ask yourself, is this truly something I believe in, or am I just hopping on the bandwagon? Have you ever noticed how you tend to feel more connected to or even defend people who share the same identity as you? Whether it's your nationality, your hobbies, or even your favorite sports team, it's a natural tendency. This is known as in-group bias. In-group bias is the phenomenon where we favor members of our own group over those who belong to different groups. It's deeply rooted in human nature. We feel a sense of belonging and trust with people who share common traits or experiences, and this can influence how we treat others, even without realizing it. For example, when two sports teams compete, fans of one team often show more support and enthusiasm for their own players, even if they make mistakes, while criticizing the other team harshly for similar actions. This bias isn't just limited to sports. It's found in every aspect of our lives, from workplace dynamics to politics, and even the way we form friendships. Dr. Olivia Richards, a social psychologist, explains, in-group bias is a product of our evolutionary history. Early humans needed to bond within their tribes for survival, and this bias helped reinforce group loyalty and cooperation. Today, it manifests in countless ways, whether in how we support our country, our cultural, practices, or even our favorite TV shows. While in-group bias can foster a sense of community, it can also lead to division and conflict. When we favor our own group too strongly, it can create us vs them mentalities, leading to prejudice or discrimination against people who are different. Recognizing in-group bias is key to building more inclusive and open-minded attitudes. By acknowledging that we all belong to multiple groups, we can challenge our assumptions and appreciate the value of diversity. So, next time you find yourself favoring someone just because they share your background or interests, take a step back and think, am I judging this situation fairly, or is my in-group bias influencing my perspective? Ever felt uneasy about making a change, even when it could be for the better? You might stick with the familiar simply because it's comfortable. This tendency is known as status quo bias. Status quo bias is the natural preference for things to stay the same. Change can feel uncomfortable or risky, and our brains tend to favor the familiar, even if it's not the best option. It's like when you continue using the same old phone or stay in a routine job, not because it's ideal, but because it's what you know. Dr. Thomas Lee, a cognitive psychologist, explains, the status quo bias is rooted in our desire for stability and predictability. Change introduces uncertainty, and that uncertainty triggers discomfort. Over time, we develop an attachment to what's familiar, even if there's a better, more efficient option available. This bias shows up in everyday life, from refusing to switch to a more efficient system at work, to avoiding a new diet or exercise routine. The status quo feels safe, and the idea of trying something new, even if it's more beneficial, can seem overwhelming. The problem with status quo bias is that it can hold us back from making positive changes. By resisting change, we limit our growth and miss out on opportunities for improvement. While some level of comfort in routine is healthy, it's important to recognize when sticking with the status quo is preventing us from moving forward. To overcome status quo bias, try to embrace small changes gradually and be open to new ideas. Challenge yourself to step outside your comfort zone and see how change can lead to better choices and a brighter future. Have you ever found yourself thinking someone is completely great just because they have one standout quality? Maybe you meet someone who's incredibly friendly, and suddenly you think they're also smart, competent, and trustworthy. That's the halo effect. The halo effect is a cognitive bias where one positive trait of a person makes you view all their other qualities more favorably, even if they don't necessarily deserve it. For example, if someone is physically attractive, you might also assume they're intelligent or good-hearted, without any real evidence to support that. Dr. Jennifer Carter, a social psychologist, explains, the halo effect works by spreading our positive feelings about one trait to other unrelated traits. It's a shortcut our brains take, often without us realizing it, which helps simplify the way we evaluate others. But this can lead to distorted judgments and unfair assumptions. This bias can have a big impact on how we form impressions, whether in personal relationships, hiring decisions, or even in how we perceive celebrities. A celebrity who is known for their kindness might be given more leniency for their flaws, simply because of their overall positive reputation. While the halo effect can create favorable impressions, it's important to be aware of it, so that you don't let one positive characteristic cloud your judgment. By recognizing when you're falling under the halo effect, you can take a more balanced view and make fairer assessments of people. So, the next time you find yourself idealizing someone because of one great quality, pause and ask yourself, am I giving them more credit than they deserve, or am I seeing the whole picture clearly? Have you ever been so sure about something that you felt invincible, only to find out later that you were wrong? That's overconfidence bias at play. Overconfidence bias is when we overestimate our own abilities, knowledge, or judgment. We tend to think we know more than we actually do, which can lead to risky decisions or poor choices. It's that feeling of certainty that can sometimes blind us to our own limitations. For example, imagine you're tackling a project at work and feel confident that you'll finish it in half the time, only to realize that you underestimated the complexity. This overconfidence might lead you to ignore potential risks or neglect important details, ultimately putting you at a disadvantage. Dr. Samuel Harris, a cognitive scientist, explains, overconfidence bias is a common trap because it comes from our desire to be right and avoid doubt. When we feel confident, we believe that we have all the answers, but in reality, we may not have the full picture, which can result in mistakes. This bias can show up in many areas of life, whether you're taking on a challenging task, making investment decisions, or even navigating personal relationships. It's easy to assume that your past successes mean you'll always be successful, but overestimating your abilities can lead to dangerous consequences. To counter overconfidence bias, it's important to check your assumptions and seek feedback from others. By being aware of your limitations and remaining open to learning, you can make better decisions and reduce the risks associated with overconfidence. So, the next time you're feeling overly confident, take a moment to step back and ask yourself, do I really know all I need to know, or am I overlooking something important? Have you ever found yourself holding on to something, even though you don't need it, simply because you're afraid of losing it? That's loss aversion, a bias that makes us fear losses more than we value potential gains. Loss aversion is the idea that we feel the pain of losing something much more intensely than the pleasure of gaining something of equal value. This makes us reluctant to part with things, whether it's an object, a relationship, or even money, even when it might be in our best interest to let go. For example, imagine you've owned a stock for years and it's dropped significantly in value. Despite the financial loss, you might hold on to it, hoping it'll go back up, simply because the thought of realizing that loss feels worse than the possibility of gaining from selling it. This can cause us to make irrational decisions, holding on to things longer than we should. Dr. Alice Mitchell, a behavioral economist, explains, loss aversion is deeply embedded in our psychology. It comes from evolutionary survival instincts. Losing something could have meant danger in the past. Today, though, it leads us to make suboptimal decisions by avoiding losses, even when holding on may not be the best choice. This bias doesn't just affect financial decisions. It can show up in all areas of life. For example, people might stay in unsatisfactory jobs or relationships simply because they fear the loss of familiarity, even if there are better opportunities available. To combat loss aversion, it's important to acknowledge the emotional weight that losses carry and make decisions based on rational analysis rather than fear. By recognizing that the potential for future gains is just as valuable as avoiding losses, you can make more balanced, informed choices. So, the next time you're hesitant to make a change because of what you might lose, ask yourself, am I holding onto this simply because I fear losing it, or is this the best choice for me right now? Have you ever thought a task would only take a few hours, only to find yourself working on it for much longer than expected? This is the planning fallacy, the tendency to underestimate how long it will take to complete a task, even if we've done similar projects in the past. The planning fallacy occurs when we're overly optimistic about our future performance and the time needed to complete tasks. We often focus on the best-case scenario, forgetting about the potential obstacles and complications that might arise. Even if we've faced similar situations before, we tend to ignore past delays and assume things will go more smoothly this time. 4. Example, think about a time when you set out to finish a project in a couple of hours, but it stretched into an entire day or longer. Despite having completed similar tasks before, the planning fallacy made you underestimate the time required. Dr. Henry Foster, a cognitive psychologist, explains, the planning fallacy is a result of our tendency to be overly optimistic and not take into account all the possible setbacks. It's easy to believe that future tasks will be easier, but past experiences show that unexpected challenges are almost always part of the process. This bias can affect everything from work projects to personal goals. It can lead to stress and frustration when we're unable to meet our expectations, and it can also cause us to miss deadlines or not allocate enough time for important tasks. To counter the planning fallacy, it's helpful to plan for setbacks and reflect on how long similar tasks have really taken in the past. Adding extra time for unforeseen complications can make you more realistic about your schedule and help you meet your goals more effectively. So, next time you start planning a project, try to factor in a little extra time and be honest about what it will really take to finish. By doing so, you'll be better prepared for the unexpected and avoid the stress of underestimating the time needed. Have you ever made a decision simply because of how something was presented to you? Even when the facts are the same, the way something is worded can influence your choices. This is known as the framing effect. The framing effect is a cognitive Bias where people's decisions are influenced by how information is presented rather than the actual content. Essentially, the same facts can lead to different choices depending on whether they're framed in a positive or negative light. For example, imagine you're choosing between two options for a product. One option is advertised as 90% fat-free, while the other is described as contains 10% fat. Both descriptions mean the same thing, but you're more likely to choose the first option because it sounds more appealing. The framing effect works by making one presentation seem more favorable than the other, even when the underlying information is identical. Dr. Linda Harris, a behavioral psychologist, explains, "The framing effect taps into our emotions and mental shortcuts. Positive framing makes us feel more confident in our choices, while negative framing may evoke fear or regret. This bias shows how easily our judgments can be swayed by language. The framing effect isn't limited to consumer decisions. It can also affect choices in politics, healthcare, and even personal relationships. A candidate might highlight their policies as helping millions rather than spending billions, and this subtle change in wording can sway public opinion. To avoid being influenced by the framing effect, it's important to focus on the actual facts and compare options without letting the presentation alter your perception. By recognizing how language shapes decisions, you can make more informed and objective choices. So, the next time you're faced with a decision, ask yourself, am I choosing based on the facts? Or is the way this is framed influencing my choice? Ever found yourself justifying a decision even though you know deep down it's not the best choice? Maybe you've eaten junk food while knowing it's unhealthy, or you've procrastinated on an important task despite valuing productivity. That's cognitive dissonance at work. Cognitive dissonance is the mental discomfort that occurs when our actions don't align with our beliefs or values. It's an uncomfortable feeling that we try to resolve by changing our beliefs, justifying our behavior, or downplaying the significance of the inconsistency. For example, imagine you believe in healthy living, but you regularly eat fast food. To ease the discomfort of this contradiction, you might tell yourself, "I deserve a treat," or "one meal won't hurt." This is cognitive dissonance. You're rationalizing your behavior to align it with your beliefs, even though you know it's contradictory. Dr. Rachel Simmons, a cognitive psychologist, explains, "Cognitive dissonance is a powerful force because it motivates us to reduce the tension we feel when our actions don't match our values. It can lead to changes in attitudes or justifications that help us feel more at peace with our choices. This bias affects many aspects of life, from our health choices to our personal relationships and even our career decisions. For example, you might continue supporting a flawed system or stay in a toxic relationship because confronting the contradiction between your beliefs and actions is too uncomfortable. Recognizing cognitive dissonance can help you make more mindful choices. Instead of justifying actions that don't align with your values, try to face the discomfort directly. Ask yourself, why am I doing this? Is it truly in line with who I want to be? This self-awareness can lead to more consistent actions and a stronger sense of integrity. So, the next time you feel that uncomfortable tension between your actions and beliefs, pause and reflect. Am I justifying this, or am I willing to make changes to align my actions with my values? These are just a few of the many cognitive biases that shape your thinking every day. Whether it's the way you make decisions, interpret information, or form opinions, these biases can heavily influence the way you see the world. Understanding these biases gives you the power to make better, more informed decisions and improve the way you approach life's challenges. By recognizing when your mind might be tricking you, you can step back, reevaluate, and choose more wisely. So, the next time you're faced with a choice, remember, your mind might be playing tricks on you. Take a moment to think critically, and you might just make a decision that's truly in line with your best interests.